what we do in this industry is we're appealing to plumbers and doctors and lawyers, obviously, and all sorts of people who find what we do is inherently not particularly interesting. So we have to dress it up. And, a powerful lead or an interesting lead really brings people in. And it's such a cliche to talk about the importance of the story. But, that's how Bill Bonner, I think, has created Agora by telling the story. And you have to tell the narrative. You have to tell the story. This is the story of this. And where do you start on that story? Do you start like, when the guy was born? No, that's going back too far. You start with what's relevant, and you start with some sort of the first 5 lines or something that draws you in. And personal, by personal narrative, you can do that, but only so long, right? How many stories can you tell about yourself and your background before someone says, "Oh boy, this again"? This guy. And then the danger is that most people's stories are, let's be honest, kind of boring.
All right, hey everyone, I'm here today with Kim Iskyan from Porter & Co. Kim, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John.
So I'm really excited to talk to you, not just because Porter & Co. has been on a tear for the last several years and growing like crazy, but you are one of the kind of top of a handful. There's just a handful, I think, of truly great editorial directors in the industry, and you are one of them. And so I'd love to kind of just, for everyone who doesn't know you, if you can give everyone kind of your background in the industry first, so we can get kind of a sense of everything that you've done in FinPub, basically.
Yeah, well, thank you, John. I appreciate that. I think part of it is that I kind of grew up in finance, and that's kind of my background before I joined the FinPub industry, and I worked on Wall Street for a few years after studying history in graduate school. And
that sounds like a perfect combination for FinPub.
Yeah, no, I grew up in Spain and I studied Latin American history. And I went to Wall Street just around the time the Latin American stock markets were taking off. And I was the one person on the desk at a mid-tier investment bank who spoke Spanish, which was occasionally a useful skill. And then I wound up, well, through an early career shift. I went to Central Asia and helped build a stock market just after the end of the Soviet Union in Kyrgyzstan, which kind of borders the northwestern border of the northwestern part of China.
You helped build a stock market? That's cool.
Yeah,
it's not a normal resume item.
No, the U.S. government was at that time very concerned about communism rolling back, and they said, well, there were all these privatizations in all these 15 Soviet socialist republics. Why don't we everybody had vouchers. Vouchers were in essence shares of these mostly worthless post-Soviet companies. And Uncle Sam said, let's build a stock market so people can trade these. And I was part of the one of the people who was given that job. And it was fantastic, exciting, and certainly gave me some insight on a different angle of finance.
Sure.
And then from there, I went to Moscow, and I was a sell-side analyst for a few investment banks. I was head of research. I knew just enough about finance, spoke enough Russian, and I did that for a while. And then a few years later, ran a hedge fund in Moscow. My timing was extraordinarily awful. I joined in early 2008, right before everything fell apart. And it fell apart here in the US, but it fell apart in a much bigger way in a lot of emerging markets, including Russia. And fast forward a few years, my dad was an early Align subscriber to Stansberry Research. And I'd read some of his stuff. And after Russia, well, I'd gotten married and we lived in Armenia, lived in Sri Lanka, moved around quite a bit. And I got in touch with Porter and said, oh, I think you need an emerging markets newsletter. And then I wound up getting a job. Another job. I worked for a political risk consulting company in DC for a few years, left the country again. And then I got back in touch and Porter said, fantastic. So I wrote a pub for Stansberry Research that was focused on investing in international markets, really obscure places. So I traveled all over the place, went to Venezuela and Iran and Hong Kong and a lot of places that were more fascinating to write about
Hmm.
than they were really investable venues, but it was a lot of fun. Um,
Yeah.
and then Stansberry Research said, "Hey, we'd like to start something in Asia. Uh, do you want to go to Singapore and build an investment newsletter company?" And I said, "Fantastic." So I went to Singapore, and in typical ready, fire, aim manner, I all I knew about the industry was what I'd kind of picked up from 2 years of writing Global Contrarian, which was the pub that I wrote, and so I was thrown in the deep end and had to learn a lot by myself, with some support from Stansberry Research. Over time, over 5 years, we built something that we reached a peak of $18 million. A lot of it was on the back of the crypto boom. Um, Eventually, Stansberry Research said, "Great, let's declare a victory. We'll absorb your subscribers, and why don't you come back?" Um, and then I wound up writing for a different Stansberry Research pub for a while. I also helped out with editorial at the Agora's UK subsidiary. Um, then a little while later, I joined Porter in July of 2022 to help build up Porter and Company. I was, I think, the fifth employee, and yeah, been here since.
Nice, nice. That's a wild set of experiences then. Um, there was a period in time in I think this was back to the 90s really in FinPub where kind of a lot of the newsletter editors were just recruited because they're good writers. And like we can teach you how to analyze stock. It's easier to teach you how to analyze stocks than it is to teach them to be a good writer. And that trend has definitely changed quite a bit. Um, but like to have as much finance experience as you've had coming into um, an industry that a lot of finance people don't respect, right? I mean, honestly, because we're talking to retail investors. How was your experience kind of making that transition to this industry? And were there a lot of like issues that you had with like I mean, you were writing a newsletter to begin with, and so there's an editorial style, then there's copy. Was that an interesting transition for you?
Well, John, I kind of backed into finance. I didn't study finance in college or grad school. Um, I didn't really like working on Wall Street, which is full of blazing assholes. Uh, and for a long time, I'd always liked writing. In eighth grade, my English teacher said, "You know what? You're a good writer." And somehow that stuck with me. And I said, "I'm a good writer. I'm going to do this." And I viewed myself for a long time as just a well-paid writer who happened to be writing about stocks in Russia.
Mhm.
I did a lot of freelance writing on the side because if you're a sell-side analyst and um, you're writing for global institutional investors, it's a very cut and dried sort of format. It's really soul destroying after a while.
Yeah,
Um, so I did a lot of writing on the side, because I love to write and to keep my sanity. So when I had the opportunity to write about finance, which I really do enjoy, but write about it in a way that wasn't so rigid and where I could
mhm.
tell stories, that was for a long time. I thought, wait, you're paying me to do this. So much fun. Um,
That's awesome.
so it wasn't that difficult a transition. It takes a little while to work out. I see it in a lot of people who wind up working in the industry. It takes a little while to work that jargon out of your style, and it also
Yeah,
takes a while to learn how to speak to the level of the subscriber where they are, and not in a way that they're not going to understand.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I remember I talked to a analyst for I forget which fund he was working for, but they sent out a note, and he's like, the way he was telling me he was trained was because it was like like I couldn't understand what he was saying, not because of the finance stuff, but because of like how complicated the sentences were, right? Like it would be like
yeah.
a sentence was this long, and he's like, no, the point of writing it so dense and complicated is you want them to know that there's something there, but you want them to pick up the phone and
So the objective
Always
is not
getting
to communicate an idea. It's
right. Exactly. It's like, oh,
No,
that's interesting.
I read sell-side investment research or even buy-side investment research, and it's just so it's so unpleasant to read. And
Yeah.
and no one reads it. That's the thing. The whole idea is that um, kind of like your guy said, you want people to know that you're there and you want them to call you if they want something or if they need some interpretation. But otherwise it's just like it's like a business card for the
Yeah.
bank you're working for. It's
That was the whole thing with MiFID in Europe when they passed those rules, and it was like all these people were getting these subscriptions to all this research that was being paid for through their refunded commissions or whatever, as kind of a, hey, we're going to give you this thing, and then when it came to like, you can't do that, you can't use soft dollars and you have to pay for it yourself, everyone was like, I don't really want this.
I don't really need it. Wait a second. Exactly. Yeah.
uh well then, let me jump. There's a bunch of things I want to ask you about your background, but let's do it within the context of kind of some of the maybe more formal questions about when you're putting together an e-letter. Like, I think this is a big one because there's a lot of different ways to do an e-letter. How do you view like constructing a new e-letter? Like, what's a good e-letter and what are the components of kind of the I guess the overarching approach versus just simply the individual articles?
Um, well, I think let's step back a moment and say, okay, what is the objective of the e-letter, right? What are you trying to do? Um, in my mind, what you're trying to do is you want your subscribers, your free names, and as well as your paid names to engage with you. You want them to know that you want to show that you have something interesting to say. You want them to come back every day. You want them to appreciate uh, and be educated and entertained by what you're saying. Um, so then out of that, you have to back out. Okay, so how do we do that? Uh, and well, when I was in Singapore and I was a one-man band for a while, I would write an e-letter every day, and I would pick something that I found interesting in the world of finance that was going on, and I'd put a different spin on it, try to make it as engaging as possible, and that was how we built up the list for a while. Um, at Porter and Company, we launched a free e-letter just a few months ago. That was Porter's initiative. So he said, "Okay, this is what we're going to do now." And I think it's evolving into really something fantastic because it has something about what's going on today, the
Mhm.
latest data, all of that kind of reinforces the bigger picture macro theme that we're talking about all the time. Has a lot of charts and graphs. It has a main piece, which Porter usually writes, which is something thoughtful, something insightful about markets, sometimes about politics, about investing. It has some sort of unique angle and take, and Porter, of course, is the master at that. So he does that extremely effectively.
Yeah.
Um, and also, let's not forget that the point is to sell. We're not doing this for fun. So we have sprinkled throughout um, somewhat subtle ad notes. And we say, we're talking about NVIDIA's results. And we say, oh, and by the way, if you want to know more about this, um, we have a whole report about this and click here. And that goes to a promo. Um, we don't have SPADs. We don't have space ads, at least not now. We want to make it feel much more kind of user-friendly. Nobody likes having these big old ads in the middle of the narrative. It kind of disrupts
Right.
everything. Um, so I guess to go to your question, John. You want something that's engaging, entertaining, um, kind of unique and unusual, and actually does add value, and
Mhm.
where someone wants to open it and isn't hit over the head with all the ads. I think maybe the most difficult part is to find something really interesting to say because there's so much content out there. Why is someone going to open your email today to hear what you have to say?
Right. And on that, I'm gonna step back for a second. You mentioned kind of things within kind of your macro theme. So is that how you guys are working, where you have a handful of large macro kind of viewpoints and then everything falls underneath those, or is there a little more of kind of a catch as you can kind of storylines?
Um, there are a lot of catch as you can storylines, and there are promos that go in different directions.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly reports that go in different directions. But we do have a handful of big picture ideas. One of them is capital efficiency. investing in capital efficient companies is over the long term the best way to grow wealth. Um, the long term, this is not unique to Portland Company, of course, the long term sort of challenges that the U.S. and the U.S. dollar face, and the danger of the debt, uh, federal debt deficit and debt. That's another theme.
Mhm.
Um, and just a handful of other things that are kind of touchstones, and they're part of the ongoing narrative. And we go back to and say, hey, we've talked about this before. And we might we have a biotech investment advisory.
Right.
Um, and that's not really capital efficient, but you can bring in a few other themes that it is linked to interest rates. You can bring in some other themes. And
Mhm.
also you want a little variety. People don't only want to
Right.
hear about capital efficiency. Okay, that's fine, but I'm not going to just invest in these boring capital efficient companies. Give me something a little bit sexier. Uh,
Right.
I think it's very, if people can come back to you and they have some sort of notion of where you're going, I think that's reassuring.
Mhm.
You open the Wall Street Journal and you have a decent sense of the tone, the structure, the approach, what they're going to be writing about. If one day you open the Wall Street Journal, um, and they talk about something completely different in a different tone that you're unfamiliar with, and it just doesn't really fit, you're going to say, "What? There's some sort of incongruency here that I don't understand." That's
Yeah.
how people, no one likes surprises like that, especially our, readers of our demographic. So I think it is important to have a few overarching themes, and you want to keep the tone kind of similar all the time.
Yeah. Then so I like that you have kind of a it's almost like you have kind of they're not I wouldn't say like they're full-blown guardrails that we only talk about these things, but you have these handful of through lines that you're always kind of coming back to, and then you're looking just for whatever else is interesting out there, but from an investment and a story standpoint that fits for the day.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes you come up with something that doesn't really fit the narrative. And it's not like you're only going to be writing about, if there is some good news on employment
Hmm.
or on, whatever it is, it's
Yeah.
not like you're going to ignore that because it doesn't really fit your narrative, right?
Right.
You got to be fair and balanced about it. But it is, like in a promo, you have the golden thread,
Hmm.
uh, sort of the theme that you come back to, and that's what kind of keeps people following along with you. I think, very broadly speaking, from an editorial perspective, it helps to have a few golden threads like that.
Yeah, no, I think so too. That's um my question, I guess, is more about how far do you take that? Because there's a tendency sometimes, okay, have a golden thread through the editorial. Does that apply to all the products for one editor, to the whole franchise? Like you said, you have um, a biotech franchise that doesn't necessarily fit some of the narratives, might fit some, but not all the threads. Um, do you want to have kind of do those? I guess I should ask it this way: do those threads pull through every level of product for, say, Porter or a different editor? Right.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily. You don't want to make handcuffs for yourself, right?
Hmm.
And there are plenty of ways that you can kind of bring in references to a biotech product when you're talking about the macro environment.
Hmm.
Um, and no, and it's nice to have the narrative, but you still need to have enough products to sell. And not everybody, like I said, not everybody is going to want to buy your capital efficient company's product. Um,
Right.
so yeah, not necessarily.
And then
Um,
does the products that don't fit kind of like the initial narrative I'm assuming then that each of those are going to develop their own kind of golden thread.
yeah, exactly. And you might say, hey, you know what? You might even say in a promo in somewhere, this is really much more speculative. We usually talk about capital efficient companies. Here we're talking about something that's, much more speculative, and you frame it in those sorts of ways so that people say, okay, I understand that this is a slight divergence.
Mm.
Um, uh, I think what you don't want to do though is suddenly something we would never do, is say, well, guess what? We have this new options product, and we're going to recommend buying calls and puts. Something, I don't know, those sorts of products in my mind are often irresponsible in how they're presented. The track records are abysmal simply because buying options is by definition a loser's game. Um, and if sort of your golden thread is, think carefully about what you do with your money, and then you go and say, hey, this is a casino, and there's minimal analysis with for example, not to bring up our biotech product again, but we have one of the best biotech guys who is extremely plugged in, does incredibly in-depth research,
Mm-hmm.
explains all the science, and he winds up being right, and it's fantastic. But something that's something that I think a lot of FinPubs overlook, or not, let me reframe that, not overlook, but they don't really take fully on board, is that if you blow up your subscriber, um, he's gone. You sell him an
Yeah.
options product, and he gets a couple of options that go to zero. He's not coming back, and you might have made your quarterly target. You might have gotten yourself a bonus for this year, but for the long-term health of the business, that's poison.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And something that I always try to do, and this is very much from Porter, is you think of the customer experience. What is the customer experience when they read this product, when they receive this email? And if you take a holistic view of that, um, you want everything to be consistent in
Mm-hmm.
tone, in character, in messaging. And if you walk into a Walmart and you have a pretty good sense of what's coming up in the aisle, what's next, how people are going to treat you. If Walmart starts selling Rolexes, you're gonna be like, wait a second, this doesn't belong here. Uh,
Right.
it's jarring. And in the same
Mm-hmm.
way, if you say, you know what, you got to be careful with your money, you have a long-term perspective. This is how you diversify. Yes, we have these kind of fun little things, but don't put too much money in those. And then if you say, guess what, we have this options product. Um, it's maybe the Rolex and the Walmart is a bad analogy, uh, but it's just something that just doesn't fit. And you say, but wait a second, this doesn't work. And that's how I
Mm-hmm.
think over time, how you lose people. And that's probably, it's not as bad as blowing them up, but it's over time it ranks up there.
That's a really interesting perspective because, one of the things we have seen in the industry is that the active trading side of the industry has grown quite a bit. There's people who are, there's a lot more I would say if you told me here there's a new publisher out there and they're doing X, right now, um, brand new to the space, and I know nothing about them, I would guess more likely that they tend to fall in that active trading, whether options or some other form of very active trading. That seems to be where not all, but the majority of the new businesses are coming up. That's separate from kind of the people who are doing their Substack newsletter businesses, right? But like the ones who are doing paid media and growing, we see a lot more energy of people coming in there. And I think one of the reasons is it's a lot harder to write good editorial than it is to send out trade alerts, um, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but that it's also an interesting thing that I've been in the business since what 2005 in one form or another. Um, every time I've talked to anybody who has interacted with their customer base and have, and I know they're not trying to gather, just for any regulators listening, they're not trying to gather information about the AUM of the clients, but for whatever reason, they get some kind of insight where somebody sends something in, and their testimonials always seem to have people, whether they use them or not, but the feedback, people who have 6, 7, 800,000, a million, five in their portfolio. Those groups, those testimonies almost always come from people who have an investing product, right? They have people who have money and they're actually investing. And then the people whose most common thing is, hey, I have $5,000 in a trading account. Um, and I'm going to use half of it. That's all I have to my name. And I'm going to use half of it to buy your product. And then I'm going to hopefully become, generate a full-time income off of the $2,500 that's left. Um, those are very super active trading clients. It's much more biz oppy, and there is space in the middle, right? But it is interesting to see that you have a very different customer um, in a lot of these cases, and there's a lot of people who are thinking of like they're going to become a professional trader somehow. Uh, whether that can actually happen or not is a argument for another day. um, But it is very interesting to me that the one that you see a lot of new businesses coming in, selling much more active trading, a lot of options businesses. Um, Two, that the client is very different. It's much more biz oppy. And I can't think of, and I'm sure someone will tell me I'm wrong, I cannot think of a option centric publishing business that has grown beyond kind of the 30 to 40 million, maybe, when things are booming size. Nobody's ever gotten much bigger than that. Not that everybody wants to, but it's a really interesting dynamic in the market. Um, and I think the editorial piece in the investment analysis piece takes so much more time that there's fewer entrants in the market on that side. Maybe, I don't know. Um, do you find it's much harder to find people who can do good analysis and write well?
I think, I mean, just to go back to your point, John, I think that there is, there are a lot of, not to, crap on options in general, there are plenty of conservative, very well structured ways that you can
Mm-hmm.
sell options and generate income and uh, I'm guessing a lot of the kind of services you're talking about sell options rather than buy. I think there's a huge distinction between those. Um, and I think that, well, and to your question, it is difficult to find, you have people who are good at finance and you have people who are good writers.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely do the two intersect. Um, so then it's always, well, do you find the good writer and train him or her up in finance? I don't know. Do you find the good finance person and just pair him up with a good managing editor so that, the gobbledygook that he would be writing is translated into English? That's, I think, the path that most people wind up taking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think, though, the bigger problem is finding those gurus who, I don't like the word guru. It just sounds to me bogus.
Yeah.
I think of like, a yogi sitting on a mountaintop or something like, I don't hear that word. But you're real person with some real financial and investment background and context and success. If they're approached by, I think, a lot of companies in our industry, they would look at some of the product and they would look at the marketing and they say, I don't want any part of that. That's schlocky.
Yeah.
That's come hither. That's, one of the enduring challenge to our industry is the sort of slickness, excessive slickness of the marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And you reference this of, sometimes people don't want to join the industry because of that.
Yeah.
Um, so then who you wind up attracting as your quote unquote guru? I mean, maybe you get somebody like that, or maybe you say, you know what? We don't have the marketers in charge of everything. And instead we have people who are really focused on content and, Mr. or Mrs. Big Time Guru, we're not going to boil you down to buy these three stocks to make 10,000% by tomorrow. But we're going to let you be your own voice and we'll nudge you, we'll encourage you, but we're going to let you write what you're going to write. And we're going to hook you up with a marketer who is going to try to market you in a way that is consistent with how you want to express yourself. Um, that may or may not work. But I think that sometimes when it does, then you have a product that virtually sells itself because you have a bona fide financial
Mm-hmm.
investment expert um, who's not who's not degraded by the marketing of the product. It sounds rude. Um, I think that's true. Um,
I can
I've
think of
seen,
a lot of editors who would say that degraded is the right word for what they've had to say in copy um, at times. Um,
yeah,
because
no, and
it
I've
is.
been on the wrong end of that. I had in Singapore, we had a fantastic uh, editor who said, you know what, I don't want to go to the boat club and have my friends say, hey, I just received this email from you in your name, and what are you doing with these people? And we could either scale back our marketing dramatically,
Mm-hmm.
uh, or they left and they left. And I think
Yeah.
there is, a lot of everybody has to write lift notes that attract attention. you have to write promos that attract attention, but what kind of promises do you make? I think a lot of it
Yeah.
hinges.
And I think that goes to the the issue with like active trading, and I'm not bashing active trading. I think there are some great trading publishers out there. But the way that people are talking about them habitually has been basically it's fast gains, right? It's about, and this is where the FTC had a lot of issues, right? It was very gain centric, it was very income centric. It's like, hey, this went up this amount, this stock went up, like the classic X pattern kind of stock promos where I'm going to show 35 parts charts of stocks that went up 3,000% at some point, because something triggered it, and that's how I'm going to sell it, versus a much more dense storyline about the investment opportunity that's there, or something that, like, one of the things that has been interesting to me about Porter and Co. has been that over the last several years, when the market, I mean, it was a bad few years in the industry for a lot of folks, but whenever there was a promo that was doing well, it invariably was coming out of you guys. And I thought that's really interesting because I know Porter is he's a unicorn. I mean, let's be real, he's a unicorn. Um, Great editor, great copywriter. Uh, he has gravitas when he speaks, and you know what I mean. Like, he just comes off really well. But you guys are also hitting themes very like topically that seem to resonate. Really strong promo, able to sell much more investment focused, thoughtful kind of product at scale, which not a lot of people can do. And so there is some kind of magic over there, um, that I think is easily replicatable, unfortunately. Um, and kind of getting at what that is hard. How do you see that? Because um, yeah, you've been in the center of it there. So how does your copy process then work? Like you said that you have the copywriter working with an editor and trying to find it, but what are you guys doing? How does this look internally?
I think Porter is so unusual in that he's fantastic at the different dimensions of the business instead of being
Mm-hmm.
really one of them, or even two of them. I think that one of the things that Porter says is that the best copy is editorial and the best editorial is copy. Uh, and in a lot of Porter and Co.'s promos, there are big chunks of editorial that find their way into the copy, and they're edited, they're modified.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if you teach somebody something, they want to keep listening to you. And
Yeah.
I think that all too often, a lot of promos, a lot of marketing um, in the industry is so much centered on the gains
Mm-hmm.
instead of, let me tell you this cool story and you'll learn something along the way.
Right.
Um, and we send out lift notes that are, in Word, they're 4, 5, 6 pages long. Um, and they tell the story. They say, let me explain this to
Mm-hmm.
you. And at the end, oh, if you want to learn more here. And a lot of those lift notes are pulled almost directly from our editorial because it's, people are learning stuff. Um, no, I'm not a copywriter. I'm not a marketer. And I'm sure there's a lot more I know there's a lot more that goes into it. I've tried to write some marketing copy and the copywriter completely slices and dices it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there is you need the lead uh, in the
Right.
promo, right? It's not gonna, you always need that. I think one of the things that Stansberry Research did very well and that Porter and Company does very well also, and I know a lot of other companies in the industry do, is have a lead for your pubs
Mm-hmm.
where you have the full story, you have the full lead, and you tell the story, and that's how you draw people in. And that's one of the things that sell side investment banking research doesn't do, right? They just hit you with all the data right now, and it's boring.
Right.
And to a lot of people, finance and investing is not inherently interesting. People who
Yeah.
aren't, just like if I'm a plumber, I hopefully find plumbing inherently interesting, but I'm not. So if you want me to listen to something about plumbing, you better dress it up. You better, take that broccoli and
Right.
pour cheese all over it. Uh, and I think that what we do in this industry is we're appealing to plumbers and doctors and lawyers, obviously, and all sorts of people
Hmm.
who find what we do is inherently not particularly interesting. So we have to dress it up. And, a powerful lead or an interesting lead really brings people in. And
Hmm.
it's such a cliche to talk about the importance of the story. But that's how Bill Bonner, I think, has created Agora by telling the story. And
Hmm.
it's something that sometimes we forget um, in the industry, and we look for the shorter way, the quicker buck,
Yeah.
um, rather than okay, let's really take a step back and how can we really engage with our customer? Well, you engage with someone, you keep someone by telling them something, helping them learn something rather that they don't already know.
Yeah, that I love that point. I think of a fantastic copywriter, Paris Lampropoulos, who was, you know, one of the near nigh unbeatable copywriters in the direct mail kind of world, and he's still phenomenal. But I remember he was saying one time about how in a direct mail piece, you have sidebars, which we don't really do anymore. Um, but if you have, I have all these old magalogs, right? I still have a bunch of files of them. And you would see that in the first several pages, every single sidebar was purely educational, right? And so they're really interesting. And it wasn't until you got like, I don't know, maybe halfway in that they started to become a little bit more promotional until they're finally like, full blown promotional. But that was always a pattern that he used was you're always making the marketing piece itself valuable, right? By having an education piece in there.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, that's to me, that's so central. And I think that's sort of the quote unquote secret sauce that's on display for a
Mhm.
lot of the promos that really work well.
Yeah, and you can see this problem, and I think some newsletters too, because it's like, oh well, you know, I have to have an e-letter, so the important thing to me is to get an e-letter out, versus this has to be an engaging, interesting piece from the customer's perspective that they're gonna be interested in. And so you see this with a lot of people who are like they're like, I'm doing a newsletter. I'm just gonna, throw some links in, just a bunch of other stuff, and here it is. It's not that interesting. It's not that much effort, not that much effort is put into it, I feel like, versus something that's very story driven. And when you talk about stories, you know, we all use, I mean, there's a lot of different types of stories. Like, what do you find? I mean, where are you going to find stories? Um, are you using, I mean, is every email or every lift or every, not lift, but every article, like I think Brian Hunt said in his perfect newsletter editor article years ago, like a perfect newsletter editor opens every um, article with a personal story. Do you find that that's the kind of stuff that you guys are doing? Um,
We do less personal stories. We actually have one of our managing editors is an absolute master at finding these stories. Uh, and what we usually wind up doing is you're talking about stock ABC, right?
mhm.
And it's in this particular sector. It has this background. It has this context. And if you can find some sort of story that's a step removed, that you say, well, this is the whole story, and maybe it's historical, maybe it's about the founding of the company, maybe it's some sort of the technology that's involved with the company, maybe it's um, the country where this particular company was founded. But
Mhm.
there's something that's a step removed, and it does take research because you have to first understand the company, understand some of the different strands of the narrative of the company, of how it came to be.
Mhm.
Then you say, okay, where else? What is something interesting about this? Um, and it's not easy. And Liz, who's fantastic at what she does, she spends a lot of time finding these, and sometimes it'll be some sort of story that's kind of two steps removed. So say, but wait a second. So we're talking about mushrooms in China, and the thing that we're selling, or not that we're selling, but the topic of the actual investment idea is, chicken wings. How is that?
Mhm.
That's just too far. But if you can bring it a little bit closer, um, and instead you talk about how the chicken wing industry was somehow cornered by this one guy, which was actually, this is a real life example. We recently wrote about it, something like this. And then it's like, wait a second, that's really interesting. So you're
Hmm.
drawn in, and it's not this big jump um, from the lead to the, the company you're talking about, to the investment idea.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess the short answer to your question is you first have to understand enough about the company, and then you just have to spend some time thinking about it and exploring different avenues, and some work, some don't. And then you have to tell the narrative. You have to tell the story. This is the story of this. And where do you start on that story? Do you start like, when the guy was born? No, that's going back too far. You start with what's relevant, and you start
Hmm.
with some sort of the first 5 lines or something that draws you in it. But it does take time. It takes time, and it takes talent. It takes a lot of skill. And the personal, you know, I the personal narrative, you can do that, but only so long, right? How many stories can you tell
Right.
about yourself and your background before someone says, "Oh boy, this again"? This
Yeah.
guy. And then the danger is that most people's stories are, let's be honest, kind of boring. Um,
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about when you were writing your first emerging markets letter, you were on the ground in all these different places. And so I would imagine that that kind of lends itself much more
yeah,
towards it.
that is different. What I would often do is say, well, I'm in Bangladesh,
Hmm.
and I'd start with some story about that. And I think you can do that, but if you're writing about, I don't know, a chicken wing company, you say, well, I went to the local mall and or okay. How compelling is that? Um, then, if you're writing about, um, a lot of the companies that all of us, a lot of companies in the world, they're not necessarily, what's your personal angle to that?
Right.
Um, I think that can work sometimes, but not all the time.
So it's not
And
just a story, it's got to be a good story too.
good story too. And then I guess just going back to the trading services, people don't buy trading services for the stories. They buy
Right.
them for the quick idea right now, right?
Hmm.
And if you try to put a lead on top of that, you know,
Just slows it down.
well,
Yeah.
that's, walking into Walmart and seeing the Rolex display. You can say, what the hell is this?
Fair. Fair. That's a really interesting approach or to think about. Um, so what are the kind of come at it from a more of a Charlie Munger angle where what was his thing? One of his many models was how to do something wrong. If you understand how to do something right, like how would you write an e-letter if you were going to guarantee that it was bad? Like what are the kind of common mistakes that you would see? Like, um, how would you do that? Like if you were going to say, I'm going to write the worst e-letter in the world that is going to be completely useless, like what's that look like?
You would um, repeat the conventional wisdom in a way that's boring and unengaging. Um, you would be more focused on selling stuff than illuminating ideas.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think, if you don't really
Nice.
have any sort of insight, but you try to share it, well, I don't care what you know, it's, ask me about something that I know nothing about. If I start writing an e-letter about cars, well,
Mm,
the hell am I going to say? I don't know anything about cars.
yeah.
So if I share that, you're going to say, well, I'm not learning anything here. Why am I reading this guy? Same thing for investing. You get someone who doesn't know anything about it, and they try to pretend that they know something about it. It
Hmm.
doesn't last long. Um,
Yeah. How do
I
you feel
think,
about sorry, go ahead before
no, I was going to go into, it's funny, before our conversation, I had a Charlie Munger quote in mind about incentives. Um, and this was more and he said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Um, and I think that in our industry, this is e-letters, but more broadly, you give people who work for you the incentive of getting as many subscribers on as soon as possible. Um, they're gonna, they're gonna write that crappy lead because
I.
I got the guy in. Now I just have to monetize them, and then I'm done. I think if you put that incentive, you flip it over on its head and you say, you know what, you're not going to get paid for bringing the name in. You're going to get paid on the renewal revenue. And it's like, oh, wait a second. What do you mean? I got to make this new subscriber stick around. Well, how do I do that? Well, you
Mm,
have compelling insight. You have great leads. You have a way to make them stick around and make them want to renew, right?
mm.
That's it's almost kind of it's almost obvious, but it's something that I think so often in our industry, people are incentivized by the wrong things. It might be right for them in the short term, but for the business over the long term, it's very detrimental.
Yeah, no, I've definitely had many conversations now with folks about compensation structures and the damages that different types of compensation has caused different businesses. Um, it's definitely an issue. It's a really good point that, and I know Porter's been huge on this lately. I think the last few years, especially, um, kind of
Yeah,
you want to compensate people based on the business actually doing well, not on some, like you said, the if you're compensated on just a front end sale, then it's very motivating to overpromise and underdeliver
bring the name in.
because
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah. So that's a I feel like that's a big conversation that I don't know that we'll ever have because or in order to have the full compensation conversation, we'll have to talk about a lot of different very specific things about a lot of very specific businesses, and I don't know that anyone really wants to do that. Um,
Yeah, no, and I think internally it's very difficult to make that sort of change because it requires a change in mentality.
mhm,
And it also entails probably a decline in income for a lot of people in the short term.
right.
You
Yeah,
know,
no one likes that.
yeah, no one likes that. That's a hard sell.
Yeah, yeah. But I forgot where I was going to go with that because there
Yeah,
was the on the where were we at? We were talking about stories. Um, I totally
Charlie
lost my
Munger.
train of thought there. Charlie
Sorry.
Munger. Yeah, I like that invert thing. That's what I was going to ask you. Was the you know a lot of things that I see now, the e-letters are kind of there, and this is again maybe more trading focused, but their e-letters are kind of becoming more and more just it's market commentary. Like, okay, here's what's going on today. Which is what you get on the news, is what you get in most places. There's a lot of places now to just go get market commentary, and it can be engaging for people who are engaged with you. But that's not the same as having here's the story of what's going on. And so I know you talk about topical things, like you said, you talk about maybe the unemployment numbers are out or whatever. Where do you see, or how do you approach this intersection of um, more researched, more thought through angles on stories and just kind of like the constant flow of economic news that's out there? Um, are you guys you're not really reporting the news so much as contextualizing it, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that's really it. You contextualize it. Opinions are like assholes, right? Everybody has one. And, do our readers really care what we are thinking about the market yesterday?
Right.
The kind of dirty secret is that nobody on earth knows why the market did XYZ yesterday. Everybody can point at certain ideas, everybody has a theory, but there's why are you gonna open up my e-letter because I have this particularly compelling insight on what the market did yesterday? Well, maybe, but there are not that many people who can draw in readers just on the
Mm-hmm.
basis of what they think about what the market did yesterday. Um, what is difficult, what's the cliche about there being so much information but no real insight?
Mm-hmm.
Something to that effect.
Yeah.
If you can contextualize it and say, okay, this is this piece of data, and this kind of fits into what we were saying earlier, the golden thread of what we've been talking about. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and if one of the golden threads is, U.S. markets are massively overvalued, you say, well, look at the percentage of global market cap that is U.S. markets. It's been going up and up and up, and Japan and the EU have been going down and down and down. Huh, that's interesting. Oh, look at all this, the inflows of into ETFs that invest in US
Right.
stocks over the past X years versus everywhere else. Wow, look at that divergence. And you have all these individual data points, and it is this narrative that's ongoing. Um, and you might say, well, and yesterday markets just did this, but that's not really your focus. You're not talking about why markets moved yesterday. You're talking about specific data points you're kind of putting in
Mhm.
into this. Markets are a mosaic, right? And at any given moment, we just see some little pieces of it. But if, as a reader, you can help me understand this little corner of that mosaic, or you can put in just enough pieces all around it. So I say, oh yeah, I kind of see that picture. And then of course
Yeah.
I'm going to go read somewhere else. I'm going to go read the Wall Street Journal or the FT or another FinPub. Okay, those are a few
Mhm.
more. But the day that somebody comes to you and tries to fill in that whole mosaic and thinks that they know all those different pieces, and boy, you got to listen to me. Nobody can do that. Um,
Right.
but if you can just make that little piece of it kind of come to life for me so I understand it, and
Mhm.
if that's the little chunk of the mosaic that I associate with you, well, that's your real estate. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think that the idea of bringing clarity to, you know, kind of the mass confusion of markets, um, is a really powerful thing that is overlooked, because it's not just the reporting of, hey, this happened. It's like, this is what it means. Um, and if that can then lead to some kind of an investment decision, even, wow, that's amazing. Um, but the how then would you say, so you're not making picks necessarily in your e-letters, right? Because that's saved for the paid product. Does the is that the only is that the primary difference between your paid and your free? Is that there are going to be actual picks in here, and so we're going to go into the stories of the picks more, or is there a different editorial approach as well?
That's something different. We sometimes talk about some of the picks in the e-letter.
Hmm.
Um, we recently started to, when a pick hits 100%, we talk about it in the free e-letter. Um, we sometimes talk about the things that have turned out well.
Yeah.
If the stock goes up by 80% and you tell your free readers about that, well, no one's going to be upset. Your paying subscribers aren't going to say, wait a second, because hey, you got in 80% ago. What are you concerned about?
Right.
And that, it creates a little bit of FOMO. It
Hmm.
also helps, um, it helps sell. How, they obviously, or they appear to know what they're doing if the stock went up this much. But um, uh, in general, there are always exceptions, but in general, yeah, the really in-depth stories and the stock recommendations are for paid subscribers, um, and we're happy to tell everybody about the successes
Right.
in the portfolio. And we also, I think, what's also important is that we explain um, where we went wrong,
Hmm.
and we've had a lot of we do a fair amount of, where necessary, falling on our sword to explain why this particular stock didn't work out. Um, I think all too often in the industry, it's very easy to say, "Oh, that didn't work. Sell. Sorry, you're down 60%. You know, tough shit. Better next
Yeah.
time. We told you you should have raised cash, and this was a risky pick." But I think there is a lot of utility to explain, well, this was our reasoning. This is where we were wrong, and you own up to it, and that builds trust
Hmm.
um, with a subscriber, and it also shows that we try to learn from our mistakes. I don't know how I got onto that after your
No, no,
question.
that's great, because the um owning mistakes and kind of building a real it's building a real relationship, right? It's rather than just a, hey, you know, beating our chest, we're amazing, um kind of marketing approach, where it's like we only talk about our winners, and it's like your customers know that they didn't make money on that stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
you're not fooling
they're very
anybody.
aware. And so to not address it, and leave those kind of elephants in the room, is definitely a mistake. um it seems to me that, and this is maybe just a strong opinion of mine, that maybe is true, maybe it's not, is that a lot of what we're doing basically in the industry, and especially on the newsletter side, is you're building investment theses, and you're selling an investment thesis in an interesting way, and that could be a micro thesis on a company, it could be a macro one, but like, it is kind of having this, you know, an essential investment thesis on what's going to happen in the market on a large scale, and then you're going to break that down on kind of a small scale. um, do you think that way? And the reason I ask is I think, like, there's a how do I put this without being a jerk to people? Because there's well, because when I was a copywriter, I was absolutely a victim of this myself. And it's this idea that like the copy's over here and the editorial's over here. Um, the copywriter drives, like you're saying in a lot of places, the copywriter drives the ideas rather than the editor driving the ideas. A lot of copywriters, when I talk to them about their editor, like if you ask them, well, what's kind of his market, what's his thesis, or what is he, they have no idea what his basic view is, but they can tell you about all these different promos. And it's like, well, there's this separation between what the guy's recommending on not just an individual level, but like broadly his perspective in what the promos are saying. And so all that to say that I feel like there's this like missed opportunity that is very core to what FinPub is, of understanding that, hey, what you're really doing in your marketing and your editorial is you're building an investment argument, an investment thesis for something. And so you should understand what that is before you even build the argument. And so I'm not sure what the question is on that, other than me ranting, other than to say, like, do you feel like, I mean, whether it's copywriters or new editorial folks, like this idea that you have to actually have an investment thesis and be able to articulate it in a way that's interesting is kind of core to what we do, or is it just in some cases and not others? Um, you thought about it?
Oh yeah, no, that's absolutely essential. I mean, you need your narrative. You need to be able to explain, okay, this is what this pub is about. And then it has to be consistent. You have to have that golden thread.
Mm-hmm.
And from a copy perspective, I've never worked at a place where I've heard about this, but I've heard enough, so I suspect it's not apocryphal, that the copywriter says, hey, you know what? This is my promo. These are the stocks. Mr. Editor, write about these stocks, recommend these stocks, um, which is wrong on so many levels.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've heard this happens, no idea when, where, how. But what, in my mind, what I tried to develop in business in Singapore, and certainly it's like in the DNA of some companies, um, the copywriters just immerse themselves in the actual content. And if the editor is doing his job, then those themes will become apparent.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just a question of digging around a little bit more to find the sort of underlying theme for a promo. Um, but yeah, you need the kind of big picture idea
Mm-hmm.
uh, that has to drive everything else, and then you need the editor to really have a clear vision of that. Um, and that's, not everybody does that. Not everybody can do that. It's not
Right.
necessarily, on the one hand, it's simple, but it's not easy, right? Um,
Right.
and then you need the copywriter who is more than just a wordsmith, but can actually understand the financial concepts. Because to me, the whole point of copy is to educate and entertain, maybe not in that order.
Yeah.
But if you don't understand the concept yourself, how are you going to explain it to somebody else? And
Yeah.
and that's how you have silos. You have the copywriter who does his magic with words that may or may not actually um, succeed in educating and entertaining in a way that is consistent with the overarching themes that the editor wants to promote.
Right. And so it seems then that the other part of this, then, not to always bash, it's not just the copywriter, but then the editor has to have actual ideas.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Right? Has to
definitely.
have actual ideas.
I'm not roasting copywriters at all.
Right. No, yeah.
Editors who
But it's like that's the two wings of the bird, right? You have to have like really, you have to have ideas that can be turned into things that can be marketable. And uh the to me, a great newsletters, right? When you read them, like they're like Bill Bonner's a great example, right? Like you're just interested in what he has to say. And then he'll say things that are really interesting, right? There's two different things. There's like, I'll say something in an interesting way, and I'll say something that's interesting. And they're not always the same, right? Like you can say something that's really interesting in a boring way, and you can say something that's really boring in an interesting way. And a great newsletter, like ideally, is more often than not doing both of those things. Like this is a really interesting thing that they're saying, and they're going to say it in a really interesting way. And that's art. It's not. unfortunately, it's not something that you can just kind of check a list and say, hey, okay, I did this, I told the story, I did this, there's an art to that.
Yeah,
But I
it's
think you have to be in love with the market to a certain degree, like you said.
yeah, you have to really, right, exactly. If I'm not interested in cars, whatever I write about is going to be flat. And someone who actually knows about cars is going to say, why am I going to read this guy? If you have someone who doesn't really know about markets, doesn't really understand investing, writing
Mm-hmm.
about whether you're an editor or a copywriter, it's going to come through, it's going to shine through pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Um,
So what would your advice be to somebody who's like, look, I write an e-letter, I write product, I want to improve, you know, the quality of what I'm doing. I want to kind of take myself up, and it's hard to say I know without seeing somebody's actual writing, but like on a general level, like, okay, I'm writing a newsletter. I kind of, I try and put some stories in there. I try and do stuff. Like, what are some pieces of advice that you would have for somebody um, to be better at it?
um, well, I think I would start with the actual, let's start at the foundation, the actual structure of the argument. How do you explain an investment idea to somebody? Kind of goes back to your thesis on a micro level, right? Are you covering all the bases? Is it interesting? Do I want to read it? Um, Often it's, I've hacked through some stuff and it's like, but what are you really saying here? And why can I not understand it? And if I can understand it, pretty good bet that our subscribers will. So you start there. And if you can't put the bricks on right, there's no way you're going to be able to build a house that that is livable. Um, And that's the challenge that a lot of people who are actually good at who understand investing and finance, they have a difficult time expressing it clearly. That's
Hmm.
where a managing editor comes in. I think after that, then you say, okay, what is the stepping back? What is this publication? What is its core idea? What is sort of the broader investment thesis? Is it, capital efficient companies that have excellent management and high ROI and, a lot of the other kind of Warren Buffett parameters? Is it, um, markets outside the US are on the verge of going through a multi-year mean reversion and catching up with US markets. So these are the sorts of countries and markets and economic characteristics we're looking for in foreign markets. Is it, um, there are these huge people don't understand how to sell options effectively. And there are these huge sort of asymmetric opportunities in options markets where you can sell options. And as long as you understand how to do it, you can do it very nimbly. And this is our sort of system for finding it. What is the
Hmm.
overarching idea? And if you can't explain that, if it's just some sort of big mishmash, that's a whole lot more difficult to sell. And subscribers or readers are going to say, well, okay, this is just all over the map. What is the
Hmm.
underlying theme? Um, and it's the same thing. Uh, if people have sort of underlying themes and ideas, right? They have values that drive them. They have behaviors. They have a way of being, and it's more or less consistent across relationships, across time. Um, And if one day, a friend of yours shows up and it's completely off the wall, he's behaving just in a way that's completely uncharacteristic. You say, but wait a second, there's something wrong. And, you know, maybe it's a stretch, but publications have that sort of same thing. Again,
Hmm.
back to the Rolexes at the Walmart, right? And you
Yeah.
need to have some sort of theme, some sort of way of talking, some sort of overarching ideas that guide you. Um, and I think that to go back to your question, if you don't have that, then you're in trouble. Um, and then, so you need to be able to express the investment thesis clearly. You need some sort of overarching idea or thesis, some sort of unifying idea that brings all the strands together. Um, then just stylistically, um, can you write in a way that's entertaining and engaging, doesn't talk down to the subscriber, doesn't assume a whole lot of prior knowledge about whatever industry or about investment
Hmm.
concepts. Um, those are more of the building blocks, but that's sort of the next stage of building blocks. And then,
Yeah.
yeah, is it educational, entertaining? Do you have a lead in there? Does the lead kind of make sense? Does it flow? Um, and is it coherent with the overall structure of that particular piece? Um, that's a lot of
That's a
advice
lot.
built in there, but
That's great. That's fantastic. Well, I appreciate it. I think we're, a little bit over our time. So I appreciate you doing this, Kim. This is awesome. And I'm looking forward to having you with us at FMS this year. You're going to be up there on the stage with us. And so I appreciate that.
awesome.
Looking forward to seeing you in person.
Thanks, John. Thanks. This is a lot of fun. I really like talking about this sort of thing.
Thanks. I appreciate it. All right. Take care.
All
Bye.
right, bye-bye.